So today we're going to talk about a man named Francis J. Grimke. He was a pastor, a co-founder of the NAACP, an advisor to presidents. I mean, he was one of the most important voices of his time, a real giant, which makes the central question of his life, well, pretty puzzling.
How does someone like that, a person with so much influence, practically vanish from our collective memory? To figure that out, we've got to understand the world he helped shape and the world that, in many ways, tried to silence him. Okay, let's get into it.
All right, first things first, let's just establish how influential Grimke really was. This isn't some minor historical footnote. We're talking about an absolute powerhouse of intellect and activism.
I mean, just look at this resume. For almost half a century, he's leading one of the most prominent black churches right in the nation's capital. He helps create the NAACP, he serves on the board of Howard University, and he was a voice that presidents actually listened to. The fact that he's not a household name today is, well, it's genuinely shocking when you see the scope of his life.
So, what kind of journey makes a man like this? Grimke's early life wasn't just tough, it was a crucible, a fire that forged these unshakable convictions he carried his whole life.
This timeline, it's just breathtaking, isn't it? He was born into slavery. He endures all of that unimaginable hardship. Then, after emancipation, he doesn't just learn, he excels. He becomes the valedictorian at Lincoln University. From there, he goes on to graduate from Princeton, one of the most prestigious seminaries in the entire country. This path, from bondage to the absolute intellectual elite of America, is just extraordinary.
And listen, this wasn't some kind of token recognition. Charles Hodge was a theological heavyweight in the 19th century. For him to say Grimke was equal to his ablest students, well, that tells you everything you need to know about the man's intellectual firepower.
So how did this brilliant mind take his faith and apply it to the world around him? This is where we find the absolute core of who Grimke was, an idea that was pretty radical then and honestly is still challenging a lot of us today.
For Grimke, this was it. This was the whole thing. You couldn't separate your personal faith from the public fight for justice. They weren't two different jobs. They were two sides of the very same coin. One was basically meaningless without the other.
And you can hear it right from the man himself. Looking back on his life, he saw these two things as his one all-consuming purpose. It wasn't faith and then activism. No, it was a faith that demanded activism.
Now, what's so fascinating here is how Grimke didn't really fit into the major Christian movements of his time. He'd look at the social gospel folks and say, "You're doing good work, but sometimes you're losing the spiritual core." And then he'd turn to the fundamentalists and say, "You're focused on the right doctrines, but you're ignoring the giant burning injustice of racism right in front of you." He saw both of them as incomplete. Grimke really admired a missionary named E. Stanley Jones. And wow, this quote just perfectly captures everything he believed. A faith that's only about saving individual souls but doesn't care about justice in society? That's a ghost. But a faith that's only about social programs with no spiritual depth? That's a corpse. Grimke was fighting for a faith that was fully, completely alive. So, as you can probably imagine, this complete, integrated vision of faith put him on a direct collision course with the very institution he loved the most, the American church, which was, let's be honest, deeply compromised by the sin of racism.
This is the kind of thing he was up against constantly. You had ministers twisting scripture to justify segregation. That claimed God himself had set racial boundaries, and so separating the races was actually doing God's will. It was a theological defense of racism, plain and simple.
And boom, this is Grimke at his sharpest. He just demolishes their entire argument with simple, devastating logic. He just instantly exposes the hypocrisy. You can't sit there and claim God-ordained segregation while conveniently ignoring your own history of crossing every boundary imaginable for conquest and profit.
And he wasn't afraid to take this fight right to his own backyard. When his own Presbyterian denomination was ready to bend its own rules just to accommodate racist churches for the sake of a merger, Grimke protested. And he protested relentlessly. He saw exactly what it was. They were choosing institutional power over real Christian brotherhood.
So why does this forgotten prophet matter so much to us today? Well, because the challenges he stared down and the principles he fought for are, believe it or not, as relevant as ever. He left behind a vision that still speaks with a ton of power.
If you boil it all down, this is what he left us. Faith has to be whole. You can't just wall off your spiritual life from what's happening in society. Injustice, and especially racism, isn't just a political problem, it's a theological one. Character is everything. And the church is supposed to be a preview of a healed, united humanity, not just another reflection of a divided world.
You know, in the end, Grimké's life is this powerful challenge to all of us. He just refused to be put in a box. He wasn't simply a conservative or a liberal. He was a man of deep orthodox faith who demanded radical social change because of that faith. He calls us to go after that same kind of wholeness.
And so that's the question he leaves us with, right? In our own fractured time, with all the pressure to pick a side and retreat into our tribes, what can we learn from his tireless pursuit of an undivided life and an undivided faith? What does it really mean to be whole?